Good afternoon. My name is Zachary Bernier, and I am here with a very special guest, Mr. Maury May. Thank you for being here.
Okay, Zach.
We are very happy that you chose to be part of this exciting project. What branch of the military were you in?
I was in the United States Army, the Green Machine, we called it.
Why did you choose that branch?
Well, I interviewed a number of recruiters. I knew I was getting drafted, and I wanted to get a better deal. The draft was not a very good deal. In the spring of 1968, right after Tet Offensive, so I went talking to recruiters, and I found that the Army gave me the best deal.
When did you serve?
I served from 1968 to 1971. So those were my active serving years. You actually had a 6-year requirement, but you had to spend 3 years active. So that was 68 to 71, but I was still in inactive reserve from 71 to 74. So technically I did not get out of the Army till 1974.
Oh, that's interesting. Where did you serve?
I served really 3 places. I had basic training in Fort Bragg, North Carolina for a couple months. And then my first year was in Fort Lee, Virginia. And then my second and third years were in Kaiserslautern, Germany, in Europe.
Okay. What was your job in the military?
My job was a desk job. I had 2 MOSs, that's military occupational specialties. And the first one was personnel clerk, and the second one was administrative clerk.
What were some of the reasons that you joined the military?
Well, as I alluded to before, I knew I was going to get drafted. And in 1968, you got drafted primarily, by the Army and tossed in the infantry. If you got drafted, it was only 2 years, so that was quicker. But if you talked to a recruiter and volunteered, you got a better deal. And yes, you had to give a 3rd year to the Army on the one hand, but you kind of got to choose your school and choose your military occupation. And I chose to be a clerk, and I was a clerk. So I had a desk job for 3 years.
Okay. And you said you were drafted, right?
No, I knew I was going to get drafted. I was out of school. You used to get a deferment from draft if you were in school, but I was out of school, out of college, and I knew I was going to get drafted because basically after Tet Offensive in January of 1968, they were drafting every little hot body they could find. So I knew I was going to get drafted, and I just wanted to make the best deal that I could.
Okay.
So that's why I went with the Army, and that's why I went with, being a clerk.
Okay. What was boot camp like?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, it was 2 months of a lot of physical activity. I remember I went in and at 155 pounds, and after 2 months, I was 165 pounds because I added 10 pounds of muscle. And the food wasn't all that bad. Actually, it was much better than college. So, I ate well, and I exercised well, and I gained 10 pounds. I've since gained about, 100 more, but we'll let that go.
Can you tell me about a memorable experience during your service?
Well, the most memorable experience I had was, not that first year in Fort Lee, Virginia, but going to Europe. In Europe, I was there for almost 2 years in Germany, in Kaiserslautern, which is in the Rhineland-Pfalz, and it's very close to the western border with France. And I was a NATO soldier. American soldiers in Germany fought with German soldiers and French soldiers and other soldiers in what's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And so what we did with NATO at that time is we were basically fighting not a hot war like what was going on in Vietnam at that time, but a Cold War where nobody was really fighting, but relations between the West, the Western democracies of Europe and North America, and the Soviet Union were pretty tense. So it was a Cold War, not a hot war, But I was proud to be a NATO soldier, and we actually won the Cold War 20 years later when Soviet Union collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the most memorable experience I had, just being over in Europe, in Germany, and being part of NATO. There are other things. I'm part German, and so I did my roots while I was over there. They stationed me 60 miles from where my great-grandfather had been born.
Oh.
And that was 1969 that I found my cousins, my German cousins. And I've stayed in contact with them and visited them many, many times over the last, 50-odd years.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, my German cousins even came here to Westport in October, just this past year.
That must have been nice.
So that's another memorable part of what I did over there.
Yeah, must have been nice to meet your family.
It was.
Some of your distant family members,
Yeah, it was in October of 1969, and it was a farm. And the farm had been in my family since 1717. And so, if you do the math, that's over 300 years. And the family still owns the farm, but they don't farm it anymore. They just lease out the properties.
What were you most proud of from your time in the military?
Well, I managed to achieve the rank of E5. Back in those days, they called it a Spec 5 or Specialist 5. It's essentially the same rank as a sergeant.
Okay.
So I did well by the Army, and every time you get a boost in rank, you get a boost in pay. So I did okay over there. The dollar was very strong relative to the old German currency, which is called the Deutschmark. Now the Germans use the euro, of course, like France and many other countries there.
How did your service shape you as a person?
It gave me a perspective on the world and its politics and its geography, because I lived in Germany for almost 2 years. I'd already had exposure to Europeans in where I grew up. I grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is right near Washington, D.C. And as a kid, I had friends who were part of the embassy groups. One of my best friend, really, at the time, went to the French school, and I met a lot of his friends. So that was the thing that I gained the most. Even more perspective on the world, and Europe especially.
Did your military service lead to the work you did after you left the military?
Not really, because I went into finance and research. Essentially, I was a stock market analyst, so I've crunched a bunch of numbers and I wrote a lot of reports. But the Army taught me, they gave me a desk job as a clerk. And so they sat me at a desk for 3 years. So I did learn how to sit at a desk and work on a typewriter and a computer, and not a computer in those days, but a calculator. And so it probably did help me in later life, because I did spend my career at a desk. So.
Okay. Thank you for your participation in this project, and thank you for your service to our nation.
Okay, well, thank you, Zach. I enjoyed this. All righty.